We are live on YouTube.
And we are live on the website.
All righty. Thank you and good evening to each and every one of you. Want to thank you once again for all that each and every one of you do for our communities. And really, you're the stewards and our eyes and ears. And I know it's been a real turbulent time. Feels like so much is going on in the world. And I want to start, of course, by acknowledging the lives that have been lost in both Israel and Palestine. I often say that there are no winners in war, and my prayers are with everybody who's impacted at this moment, and we'll continue to pray for all. With that being said, I'm going to move on, and I want to thank Tim for all that you do in really bringing together our civic infrastructure right here, and that's what makes Queens what it is, our diversity, and one of the best things about us all coming together on a line like this is, you get to hear the commonalities on issues that all of us are impacted by, and we also get to fellowship and learn together as well. So I want to thank Tim for his leadership. Of course, as the borough president, I get all the credit, but it is his work that has us here tonight. Tonight, I'm thrilled and honored to be with you all to discuss a topic that is not only personal to me, but is something that will impact many voters across New York State. Before I begin, I would like to thank each and every one of you for being here today. There's power in numbers, and when folks come together, we are informed and civically engaged, and of course, anything is possible. The last few months have been tough, not only in America, but all across the world. The reality is, over the past few years, we've been in a battle all across this country over our fundamental rights and liberties when it comes to participating in our democracy. And I won't politicize this, but we know what January 6th represents. Certainly, as the first Black man to be Queensborough president, and just getting back from Nigeria, my first trip to Africa, just about a month ago, my ancestors would have never imagined that I would be in the position that I am in today. And just a couple of years ago, my father became a United States citizen in 2020. And the first election he can vote in was mine. And as I always say, I don't think he voted for me. I think he voted for Tim. But we all know that, on a serious note, voter disenfranchisement is not a myth or a talking point. From voter intimidation and inadequate levels of resources to lack of language access and inconvenient or last-minute changes to polling locations, we are all being impacted. There are far too many communities throughout Queens and New York State that have a history of voter disenfranchisement. So when we hear people talk about limiting who gets to vote or making it difficult for folks to vote, remember that at the end of the day, that is not true democracy. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York will be the strongest and most comprehensive state voting right acts to date. The right to vote is fundamentally the right to demand better. The act failed to pass on the federal level 2 years ago, but thanks to the hard work of our state Senate and Assembly, it's now a reality. Today's webinar will go into the importance of the New York Voting Rights Act and what it means for each and every one of us, especially our underserved and minority communities. This historic legislation will root out discrimination against voters of color in New York and immediately makes our state a national leader in protecting the fundamental right to vote. I implore each and every one of you on this call today to take the information that you learn back to your community. Be sure to ask questions and ensure that your voice is heard through the process. Our panel today is full of experts that live and breathe this work. I'd like to first start by introducing my colleague in government. I don't get to Brooklyn much. There are a few things I like about Brooklyn. I would say that I'm stamping his passport, but we on Zoom, so I'm gonna stamp the Zoom tonight. For New York State Senator Zelnor Myrie, who I'm a big fan of, who's doing outstanding work in leading this fight in Albany. And of course, for those of you who don't know, Senator Myrie is the author of the John R. Lewis New York Voting Rights Act. He was the Senate's lead sponsor and fought tooth and nail to get this done. It's great to have you here, my brother. We are also joined by Perry Grossman, who is a supervising attorney from the New York Civil Liberties Union. Perry has been litigating and advocating for voting rights and election law for years, and he will make sure everyone leaves today's webinar as an election law expert. Last but not least, we are also joined by my good friend, the godfather of redistricting. I don't know if everybody will feel the same way with all the redistricting confusion, but certainly someone who knows a great deal about this issue, Professor Jeffrey M. Weiss from the New York Law School. Professor Weiss has decades of experience in region, which will have a huge role to play when it comes to the New York Voting Rights Act. In closing, and to stick with the theme for today, I would like to share a quote from the great John Lewis, who I actually had the honor of having lunch with Congressmember Gregory Meeks, probably, I want to say about 6 years ago. He was out in Southeast Queens and I got to pick his brain. And it was one of the most impactful moments of my life, quite frankly, of my career. And he was a special, special person who thought that the food at the door, for those of us from Southeast Queens, was the best food he ever had. But my dear friends, this was a quote from him, my dear friends, your vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the powerful nonviolent tool we have to create a more perfect union. So tonight, let's make sure you get out there and use your sacred vote. And let's Tim, who will be the rest of this webinar. Thank you. It's great to see you all. Can't wait to see you all in person. And God bless. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Borough President. And it might seem like we've been doing this forever, but it's only a couple of years old that when the Borough President came into office and launched the Civic Engagement Department, we've really accelerated our emphasis and attention to this work and this very important community engagement. And that's all thanks to our support from our great BP. And without further ado, let's get into this very important topic that we're going to be focusing on today. Just to formally introduce our first speaker, of course, New York State Senator Zelnor Myrie, who is a Brooklyn native and an affordable housing advocate serving the 20th Senate District. Since joining the Senate in 2019, Senator Myrie has served in leadership roles and won several major legislative victories, including New York's strongest affordable housing and tenant protection laws in generations, along with sweeping reforms to New York's criminal legal system. As chair of the Elections Committee, Senator Myrie presided over historic election reforms, including early voting, closing the LLC loophole, and simplifying the absentee ballot process. And of course, as the Borough President said, he is the author of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York, which has been hailed as the strongest voting rights law in any state in the country. And we're honored and very happy to have you here, Senator. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tim. And let me just say how exciting it was to get the invitation from you, Tim, and from my brother, the Borough President of Queens. If I can, for a moment, just brag about seeing him grow from a staff member. We were both working at the city council for different council members. And even back then, as many of you know, because you lived with him, we knew that he was destined for many big things. And so it has been wonderful to watch him, not just as Borough President, but even in the council, as chair of the Public Safety Committee, as someone that was dedicated to public safety and justice for people that look like him and me. It's been an honor to watch him ascend to the Queens Borough Presidency. And I'm really just grateful to have the virtual stamp tonight to be with y'all in Queens. You know, we have so many similarities between Brooklyn and Queens. Of course, we are on the same island, which I hate to concede to our brothers and sisters from Long Island, but we are neighbors in the truest sense. But we have also had a history of voter disenfranchisement. And I wanted to start there because oftentimes when we talk about voter suppression, when we talk about voter dilution, when we talk about people not having the access that they should, we think that this is a relic of the past. We think that this is relegated to the South, that this is happening in other parts of the country. But the truth is, the Federal Voting Rights Act, when it existed prior to the Supreme Court eviscerating its strongest provision, was in effect here in the city of New York. And it was in effect in the city of New York for a reason. And that is because those who have recognized that voting is the right that protects every other right have also worked just as hard to prevent communities that look like Queens, communities that look like Brooklyn, from fully engaging in that right and fully taking advantage of what the Constitution has given us. I've had the honor of chairing the Elections Committee in the Senate since entering the Senate in 2019, and I've been very proud of a lot of the things that we've done. You heard some of that clicked off in the introductions, but we've made close to 110 changes to the election law in the past 5 years, which has been really remarkable and not possible without many of you on this call who have been civically engaged, who went up to Albany, who ensured that we stayed true to the tenets of our democracy. So I've been proud of that, but I have to say that there is nothing that I have been more proud of than sponsoring and passing the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York. Now, two of my fellow panelists, who you will hear from shortly, and who, by the way, are the smartest people on this issue, not just in the state of New York, but in the entire country, they might remember that we held a hearing in 2019 towards the end, 2020, I'm sorry, to discuss how early voting went. And if we were all in the room together, I'd ask everyone to raise their hand if they've taken advantage of early voting yet, because it's always good to see the culture shift. All right, I see some virtual hands up, And we wanted to look to see whether or not this was an effective opening of our democracy. And in that hearing, I had an exchange with Perry Grossman, again, who you will hear from very shortly. And I said, well, what can we be doing better? And we started talking about the impact of the Federal Voting Rights Act. And I think in that particular line of questioning, it was on Section 2. And I started asking about what state level protections that we had, and whether it was necessary for us to implement a state version of what we saw on the federal level. And Perry said yes. And he joined in along with the NAACP, who you will also be hearing from tonight as well. And we were able to draft something that became ultimately the strongest state level voter protection law in the entire country. Now, for those of you wondering, well, why would we need that here in New York? Why would we need any sorts of protection? And here's why. Fundamentally, prior to this being passed, there was no law on the books that said if an issue comes before the court, if the court has to decide whether to be in favor for the voter or to be in favor for something else, there was nothing in our laws that said you have to prioritize an individual's right to vote, an individual's right to participate in their democracy. So we started off, the very beginning of our law is what we call the democracy canon, which is to say that voting and the individual access to voting trumps everything else. And that's not insignificant in an era where we currently are debating whether or not someone who attacked our democracy should now lead it in the House of Representatives. We are having this discussion while individuals have pleaded guilty to interfering in our democracy. People who took our democracy for granted now realizing that we have to be intentional about keeping it. So that was how we started off the Voting Rights Act. But one of the most important provisions in the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York is something what we call pre-clearance. Now, before the Supreme Court destroyed Section 5 on the federal level, we could not make changes to the procedures and protocols of our elections without first getting it cleared by the Attorney General on the federal level. And whether or not you were a jurisdiction that fell under that pre-clearance requirement was due to a host of factors. As I mentioned before, New York City was included in that. And what we did not have after that section was pulled out in what has been called the strongest civil rights provision in our nation's history, we saw immediately in the wake of the 2013 Shelby case, voter ID laws springing up across the country, other voter suppression tactics to keep people from voting, and it had a material effect on voter participation, particularly for Black and Brown communities. And so what we did in the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act is said, we're going to do a pre-clearance regime, but we're going to have one right here in the state of New York. If you are a town or a village or a municipality or some other jurisdiction seeking to make changes to how elections are conducted, you must first get clearance from the Attorney General of New York. And it was really exciting to see just a couple of weeks ago, the Attorney General certified both to the State Senate and the Assembly that they are ready to start this process of pre-clearance, ready to start this process of enforcement. And the unfortunate reality is our democracy has not, by some random law of physics, continued and continue to be successful. At each juncture in our country, we have had to fight fiercely to preserve our democracy. And when I say we in this context, it has oftentimes been Black and Brown people because they have been the targets of voter suppression and voter dilution. So what we were able to do in the New York version was give that pre-clearance power to the state attorney general, but we also did something really important, and I'm going to tell this anecdote, and then I'll shut up and pass it to the real experts. We allowed for something called a safe harbor provision, and what that means is a lot of times in order to enforce our election laws, we got to go to court. Whether that's the Attorney General, whether that's Perry sticking up for voters across the state. And that costs a lot of money, it costs a lot of time, and it is taxpayer dollars that end up having to be circulated to keep that litigation going. We said, well, why don't we make it such that if you feel that your voting rights have been violated, send a warning, a letter to the jurisdiction to say you are in violation of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. You now have a certain period of time to correct that violation. And if you do so within that period of time, no court case, no litigation, no waste of taxpayer or private dollars, we have now gotten to the solution. And the very first usage of that safe harbor provision happened this past summer up in Westchester County. The town of Mount Pleasant was put on notice by 6 Latino residents from the village of Sleepy Hollow to say that the structure of which you were using to elect people has discriminated against us. We have never been able to elect a Latino, someone that looks like me, into office before. And they're currently going through the process. And I realize that Professor Weiss, having been hired as a consultant, may not be able to speak to the specifics of that case, but I will say that it has been an exciting development to see the law used and the potential to have people elect someone that looks like them. You know, our borough president just mentioned that he's the first Black man to occupy that office in the office's history, and it is I think it's unsurprising that we are still having these first pop up in our democracy, but it is also encouraging, and it is also important for us to equip people with the tools that they need. So I will end by saying this: the law is only going to be as strong as you are. We are going to need every single person to remain vigilant in order to have the law be enforced and upheld in the way that we deserve for it to be. As the borough president mentioned, he quoted John R. Lewis, and of course we are familiar with good trouble and principle and value of making good trouble. And I have enjoyed very much holding that position in the state Senate and making good trouble for our democracy. But it is also important that each and every one of you feel that obligation to continue his fight and to continue that trouble. You are fighting for individuals that you will never meet, you will never see, and you'll never get a thank you from. But the work that you do to ensure that this law is held up, ensure that it is forced, it's going to make way for generations of people. In the same way that there were individuals that fought before we did, people that put blood on the line in order for us to have the franchise. believe we are in a similar moment in our republic and in our country where we need champions of democracy. And I believe that this law gives us the tools to do it. So again, thank you so much for having me tonight, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Senator Myrie. Very important and impactful information that you shared with us here today. And to segue through our agenda, up next, we're going to be hearing from Perry Grossman, who is the director of the Voting Rights Project with the New York Civil Liberties Union. Perry is a supervising attorney whose work focuses primarily on litigation and advocacy efforts concerning voting rights and election law issues. Perry regularly testifies before state and local legislative bodies concerning voting rights and election administration. He also teaches a seminar on voting rights as an adjunct professor at Fordham Law School and is an occasional contributor to Slate on legal issues. Perry, you're up next.
Thanks so much, Tim. It is a pleasure to be here. It is, generally speaking, my job to sue the government. So I do not take lightly the opportunity to praise government officials, but you got to when they do the right thing. I'm pleased to say this is not my first time talking about the New York Voting Rights Act at the invitation of the Queensborough president, and the Queensborough president's office and BP Richards were really champions of the legislation as it was moving, and Queens really came out strong to help motivate it to pass the legislature. And certainly I want to take the opportunity to say thank you to Senator Myrie, who really did a lot of work to shepherd a great bill through the legislature. And the fact that we've seen 105 changes to the election law just tells you the bad shape that New York elections were in before January 1st, 2019. And we really have gone a long way since then. I know Senator Myrie likes to talk about from worst to first. We're not first yet. We got a long way to go, but we're doing a pretty good job making progress. And so let me talk a little bit about the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of New York and what it does on a more mechanical level, but also what it does on a national level, right? There's two important policy purposes, or political purposes for the New York Voting Rights Act. One is because, as Senator Myrie was describing, we have a host of real live voting issues that take place in New York, right? And it varies very much from region to region. Upstate, even Westchester, Long Island, we have lots and lots of local government elections using what are called at-large elections, right? Where every member of the jurisdiction votes for everybody on the school board or the town board or the village council, places like that. And where you have racially polarized voting, a racial majority can consistently outvote and deny any representation to a racial minority. And that has been a practice that has been flagged by the US Supreme Court for many, many years as being fiercely dilutive. And what we did in the New York Voting Rights Act is take the lessons that we've learned over nearly 60 years of federal Voting Rights Act enforcement and innovated to make voting rights enforcement more efficient and more effective. In Queens, there are different problems, right? We see polling places getting moved at the last minute. We see a borough that has more language diversity than anywhere else in the United States, and lots of communities can't get election materials in their own language. And so the New York Voting Rights Act expands language assistance because having election materials in your own language isn't simply important to make sure that you're able to cast a ballot. It also says that you are welcome in our democracy, that we want your participation, right? That you are as valid as any English-speaking voter, and you know, really makes our democracy a more inclusive one. As Senator Myrie talked about with pre-clearance, pre-clearance is particularly important because especially when it comes to those last-minute changes like polling places, it's very, very hard to run in and sue over it. I know I have dealt with, you know, calls from communities where they say, you know, we just showed up and our polling place isn't even there. It's moved 5 blocks away, or we don't know where it is at all. And there was simply no way for the community to act in time to challenge that issue. And so what pre-clearance does is it makes boards of elections contemplate the consequences of changes to the way elections are run. And so it's not going to slow anything down. And it's not going to impose any serious burdens, but it's going to make election officials be more thoughtful about the changes they make and to make sure that communities of color are not made worse off by changes in whether it's polling places or voter purges or failures of language assistance, to make sure that we're getting it right and putting the burden on election officials to make sure that we're getting it right, rather than putting the burden on voters to have to go out and catch every instance of discrimination. So pre-clearance is really, it was the crown jewel of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I think it's the crown jewel of the New York Voting Rights Act. And certainly, I'm proud to say that as Senator Myrie noted, the AG certified it, and I really look forward to them being able to enforce it and improve the way our elections are run. Senator Myrie mentioned the democracy canon. The democracy canon is important because there are so many ways, and fewer than there used to be, but there's so many ways for technical glitches to throw out somebody's right to vote. It used to be, little stray marks on the ballot, or, the failure to sign your absentee ballot, or the failure to date something. And the fact is, these are silly things that should not prevent an eligible voter from casting a valid ballot. And so to prevent judges and candidates from throwing out the ballots of New Yorkers who should be able to exercise their right to vote, we're putting a thumb on the scale of the voters. And so that ends up really being really important, making sure votes get counted. We've got language assistance, vote dilution we've talked about, redistricting plans. Jeff will get into that more. But obviously redistricting plans can be real opportunities for discrimination in a very subtle way. It's very difficult for an individual, even an extremely well-trained individual, to eyeball a redistricting plan and say, yep, that dilutes the votes of voters of color, right? It takes really in-depth analysis and expertise in order to do that. And so what the New York Voting Rights Act does is simply innovates the law as it's been to make redistricting litigation, to make other vote dilution litigation more efficient and more effective. And the safe harbor provision that Senator Myrie mentioned before, I think is a really critical thing, because there are so many jurisdictions where racial vote dilution is occurring, but it's not the fault of the current elected officials, right? They want to see equitable elections as much as anybody else. I hope this is the case in Mount Pleasant, but certainly what they've done so far is the right thing, right? They received that letter that Senator Myrie mentioned from Latino voters who had been unable to elect their candidate of choice because of racially polarized voting in an at-large election. The town of Mount Pleasant, rather than say, well, we're going to fight this down to the ground, passed a resolution that said, we're going to hire real live experts to look at this and contemplate what our remedies should be. How can we make our elections more equitable? And hopefully that's all going to end without litigation. And that's going to save the taxpayers money. It's going to build confidence in elections. And more importantly, it is going to make representation more fair at the local government level, because we really don't think about those local governments as often as we should. But that's where our primary services are coming from. We talk about the presidency and Congress and Albany, but your public education, public safety, transportation, parks, sanitation, that's all coming from local governments. And so making sure that we have fair and equitable representation in local governments, and making sure that election structures respect the right to vote and don't suppress it in ways that they shouldn't. That's important to making New York a much fairer and healthier democracy. So that's all important in terms of remedying actual ongoing voting problems in New York State. But New York has also become a national model. I'm almost a little bit nervous to say that the New York Voting Rights Act might not be the strongest and most comprehensive Voting Rights Act in the country, because Connecticut took us as a model and they passed their own Voting Rights Act. A Harvard law professor recently published a law review article referring to the New York model as the new breed of state voting rights acts. And so, we've learned from the Federal Voting Rights Act, we've learned from the more limited state voting rights acts that have come before us, but now we're serving as a model for a new set of voting rights acts whether it's Connecticut that's already passed, Michigan that's on the cusp of passing, New Jersey, which is looking at it, Maryland. And, as we continue to innovate, more states are going to take this forward because we are seeing a crisis of democracy in the United States. And by starting in New York, by saying we can do better, we can provide a better measure of accountability in government by providing more equity and inclusion in government. We're going to shift the reference frame nationally away from the kind of voter suppression and vote dilution that we're seeing elsewhere towards ultimately a healthier democracy in other states and nationwide. So I'm extremely proud of everything that the New York Voting Rights Act has accomplished and will accomplish here in New York State, but I'm also just so proud of the model that it's serving to other states as well. And I look forward to learning from those states as they pass more and better stuff. And we've got more things coming. One piece of the New York Voting Rights Act that hopefully will pass in this upcoming legislative session is a database of voting and election materials. Because right now, it is shockingly difficult to get your hands on records that you would think should be easily, readily available from a central location. Election results, voter files, redistricting plans, things like that. You've got to go all over the state. If I wanted to collect a comprehensive list of election results for school districts, I'd have to send 700 foils. If I wanted to do it for every local government in the state, I'd have to send over 3,000. And that's silly. We should have our elections and our data in one place where scholars can analyze it, where we can learn and make better policy. And so that's something we're really looking at getting moving in January, because that's going to improve our State Voting Rights Act enforcement. It's also going to create a joint center at SUNY, the CUNY Graduate Center, and Medgar Evers College, so that we have a real base to take our public universities and make them innovators and great scholars, gold standard scholars, when it comes to democracy in the United States. So also proud of what they're going to be able to accomplish and help others accomplish.
Thank you so much, Perry. Also, lots of valuable information there. And we're just going to keep the train going here. Up next, we'll be hearing from Professor Jeffrey M. Weiss, who is an adjunct professor and senior fellow at the New York Law School, where he directs the New York Census and Redistricting Institute. He is now working on his 5th census and redistricting cycle. In past years, he organized census outreach efforts and served as redistricting counsel to 5 state assembly speakers and 4 state Senate Democratic leaders. Jeff also served as counsel to the last 2 New York City Council redistricting commissions. Welcome, Jeff.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Tim, and good evening, everybody. My good friends, Senator Myrie, Perry Grossman, who will be joining me at my law school class next week to discuss these very same issues again. And of course, the borough president, thank you so much for having me on tonight. I'm going to drill down a little bit with a PowerPoint and show you some of the kinds of factors that go into the legal issues that the Senator and Perry have talked about. But just to give you a little bit of the context of what's happening in Mount Pleasant. And Mount Pleasant is a township in Westchester County, which includes the hamlet of Sleepy Hollow. Sleepy Hollow is just north of Tarrytown. If you know where the Tappan Zee Bridge, the Mario M. Cuomo Bridge is, it's right in that community, that area. And Mount Pleasant has had its town charter in place for decades. And by having an at-large town board where all the members are elected at large, you don't vote for them by single district, but you vote for all 4 or 5 members as a group. So that makes it very hard for minority community preferred candidates to elect their preferred candidates when their votes are pretty much submerged or diluted by the entire township. And here we have a situation where the Hispanic community represents a good sizable portion of the township. And the township only has 44,000 people. So we're talking about a very small area. And as Perry mentioned, the voters in that township in Sleepy Hollow sent a letter to the town. The town has a period of time to consider what to do, how to change things. And if things work out amicably and agreed to, then it will avoid costly litigation. Where also, if the change is finally made, ordered by the court, the local government has to pay for it. So it's in everyone's interest to do the right thing. And I won't get into the details beyond what I've said. Working with a nationally recognized voting rights expert to do the algorithmic work to really to figure out who votes for who and whether there is polarized voting. And polarized voting is where minority voters are not able to elect their preferred candidates because the white voters consistently outvote them. And where you have a high level of racially polarized voting, depending on the circumstances, either the federal or the state or both voting rights acts call for a remedy, which is usually in this situation for redistricting to go from an at-large scheme where everyone is elected at large to single-member districts or possibly cumulative voting or ranked choice voting, but not to keep things the way they are. And in New York State, in the last decade or so, there have been several cases brought under the Federal Voting Rights Act alleging vote dilution. Perry was a successful attorney in one of those cases that challenged the school board in East Ramapo in Rockland County. There have been other successful challenges under the Federal Voting Rights Act in Niagara County, Western New York, Albany County, Suffolk County, in the town of Islip, and in the town of Hempstead, neighboring Queens in Southwest Nassau County, where at-large school boards or town councils have been changed over from at-large schemes where everybody's elected at-large together to single-member districts where the minority voters in a compact single-member district can elect their preferred candidate. I'll just mention before I get into the state law that under federal standards, when you bring, a Voting Rights Act challenge, you're generally required to prove to a court that you can create a minority district that has at least 50% of minority voters in that proposed district. That's a high bar to reach. And as I'll show you in my PowerPoint, the New York state law goes beyond that and creates a more open standard, making it much easier for
Avery,
Black or
I'm going to
Hispanic.
be in session.
Am I still on the camera?
Yeah, you're good, Professor.
Okay, so I'll get into that in a few moments. So Tim, if I have screen sharing privileges, I will begin.
Yes, you should be good.
Okay.
Great.
Okay, so I will get going here. Let me just, okay. Okay, so in the context of redistricting, and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act has several different parts to it. It has vote dilution, causes of action, ways to challenge weak or dilutive voting laws. It has, as Perry mentioned, a section on language assistance, a section preventing voter intimidation, and a section, a major section requiring pre-clearance. And pre-clearance, as Perry alluded to, under federal law, under what was called Section 5 of the Federal Voting Rights Act, that any law, whether it was a redistricting plan or the location of a polling place or the wording of how the ballot questions appeared, they all had to be pre-cleared or pre-approved by the U.S. Justice Department or a special federal district court in Washington, D.C. The Section 5 applied to about a dozen states in the Deep South, but also covered Brooklyn, the Bronx, and New York counties, Manhattan, because of a very low level of minority voting in the 1960s, coupled by New York State's literacy test those of you who didn't vote until the 1970s, New York State actually required people to be able to read and write, speak English to be able to vote. That was in the Constitution. It was revoked. It was eliminated back in 1969. But it's a little known fact that you should be aware of in terms of, is there discriminatory voting in New York? In 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court invalidated the federal law, Section 5, over its triggering mechanism that used these 1960s election formulas to determine which states and localities would be covered by it. And Section 5 is no longer enforceable. New York used to have to submit redistricting plans, changes to the way elections were run, all sorts of things to the Justice Department in DC. But that's behind us, and Senator Myrie and his colleagues in the Senate and the Assembly, as well as in other states, put forward bills to fix the problem that the Supreme Court created in 2013 in the case of Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder. So I'm going to focus now just on the redistricting sections, and redistricting in New York seems to be the issue that isn't going away because our congressional redistricting is still in the courts, and that's not the topic of tonight's conversation, but redistricting will play a major role because even though most localities, the state Senate, state Assembly, city council, counties and towns all across the state have pretty much completed drawing their new district lines after the 2020 census, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act brings a new cause of action, as lawyers call it, that enable you to challenge an existing plan any time of the decade. Now, New York City went through a councilmanic redistricting process last year. 51 districts were all redrawn. You're all voting on those candidates next month. And the New York City plan actually created one new open Asian voter district in Brooklyn. And many of you may be living in districts that were redrawn, but the New York City Council plan was drawn based on federal law, state law, and the New York City Charter. There was one challenge brought to the City Council plan in state Supreme Court, arguing that there should have been an additional South Asian district created in the Ozone Park, Richmond Hill community. But the judge dismissed that case, saying that it was without merit. There's been an appeal pending since June. The plaintiffs have not move forward on that appeal. They have about a month left to make their case, or the case will simply be dismissed. But we're not going to be discussing the city council redistricting tonight, but I'll give you a sense of what's going to happen in other parts of the state. So if we have a district-based method of electing local board members that uses a districting plan in which each member resides within a district, and only if members of that specific district elect members of that governing body. That's a district-based method where you have one person elected per district. And a violation can be established if a political subdivision uses a district-based method or an at-large method, and it's shown that candidates or voters can't elect their preferred candidates because of racially polarized voting, and that under the totality of the circumstances, socioeconomic factors, the ability of members of the protected class to elect candidates of their choice, or the outcome of those elections is impaired. I meant to include another section of the law here. I didn't get to put this together until this afternoon, but there's a separate paragraph in the law that refers specifically to at-large elections. And that's really what we're talking about, more than district-based elections that can still be challenged if they're found to be vote dilutive. Now, if you want to bring a challenge to a redistricting map, there's various pieces of evidence you've got to show. You have to be able to show, and these are not all required, but these are simply some of the factors, that there's evidence that more than one protected class of eligible voters are politically cohesive, and that members of those protected classes also may be combined. What this means is that if you have, let's say, Black voters and Hispanic voters, and they live in a compact geographic area adjacent to each other, and they can't quite reach the federal standard of creating a district of 50% minority voting age population residents. Under the New York law, you can combine those groups together, and they don't necessarily need to create a supermajority. That goes beyond the federal requirement. You also can bring evidence on the intent of the voters or elected officials to discriminate against protected classes. You don't need to bring that kind of evidence, as you do need to show in federal court. You also can look at the next to the last factor here, evidence concerning whether members of a protected class, meaning for New York City, Black, Hispanic, or Asian voters, are geographically compact or concentrated, shall not be considered, but may be a factor. So this really lowers the, or actually expands the standard that under federal law, you have a very high test to meet, and you cannot combine Black and Hispanic voters in one district. Although the courts are divided on this, federal law generally requires that to create an effective minority district, it needs to reach 50% Black or 50% Hispanic or 50% Asian. Under the state law, you have a different standard. Now, when we look at the what's going on behind the scenes, you want to look at some of the factors that come to bear. And these are called the totality of the circumstances test. And most of these were first developed by the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee in 1982 to apply to the Federal Voting Rights Act. And I won't read each one of these, but you can see them here. If there's been a history of discrimination locally, to the level, the extent to which members of the protected class have been elected to office, the use of any kind of voting law that might dilute the current elective scheme, the denial of access to voters or candidates to even run for office. This is an issue that has come up a lot in New York City with public financing, the extent to which members of the protected groups contribute to political campaigns at lower rates, voting at lower rates, disadvantaged voters, communities in terms of education, employment, health, criminal justice, housing, environmental protection. In the Suffolk County Islip Township voting rights case about 3 years ago, it was shown that the township dumped hazardous environmental waste in a park in the Hispanic community. That's discriminatory. So there are various kinds of factors here. The use of overt or subtle racial appeals in political campaigns. Now, you all live in Queens County, but if you go out to Nassau and Suffolk County, you're going to see political ads saying, "We don't want to be like New York City. We don't want those gangs from Brooklyn coming over to Suffolk County." This is, these are pieces of literature that I've seen. You also want to look to see if local officials have not been responsive in their constituent services. So these are the various kinds of factors that you look at. Now, who can bring these challenges? According to the law, any person who is negatively impacted or any organization whose membership includes or is likely to include those negatively impacted, those kind of groups can bring an action under the New York State Voting Rights Act, or the state attorney general can do so. In the case of Mount Pleasant, as we're seeing now, it's really the first and only challenge so far, a local law firm filed a letter on behalf of 6 voters in Mount Pleasant. So if that, depending on where that goes, will avoid litigation, and the Attorney General would only play a role to approve the plan afterwards. Now, once this gets going, and this is where we are now in Mount Pleasant, we're looking to schedule public hearings to figure out how to revise the districting plan. So there's a period of time for the public to comment on the plan. There needs to be a draft plan made available for public comment, and then hearings to allow the public to provide input to review the plan after it's proposed. This is much different than what we've seen in the state legislature in recent decades, where plans are often developed after hearings and public comment, but then there's no conversation at the tail end of the period after the draft plan has been announced. The state law now for localities requires that this take place. Now, Perry also mentioned pre-clearance. The Attorney General's office is now developing a list of jurisdictions in New York State that have had a history of voter discrimination, whether it's a history of lawsuits challenging electoral discrimination, whether there have been problems with language voter assistance, if there have been a significant number of vote dilution incidents in a town, in a county, in a city, then the Attorney General is developing a list which may be published by the end of the year. We don't really know yet the exact date, that will put them on notice that they are going to need to pre-clear any new law involving elections with the state Attorney General. And these are the kinds of laws that would need to be pre-cleared: the methods of elections, forms of government, corporations, consolidations, and a New York City issue, removal of voters from enrollment lists or other list maintenance activities. If you recall, several hundred voters from Brooklyn were removed from the rolls a few years ago. So this list here shows you the kinds of issues that localities who are going to need to have their laws pre-cleared, have to consider. And here, this actually lays out the kinds of issues that pre-clearance will require. These are the issues here. A, if there've been court orders or violations of election laws. If they B, if a political subdivision or local government has become subject to at least 3 court orders for violating a federal civil rights law or the 14th Amendment. Any county where the felony arrest rate of members of a protected class exceeds that of the citizen voting age population as a whole by at least 20%. Any political subdivision where you have 25,000 citizens of voting age or whose members comprise 10% of the citizen voting age in the political subdivision with respect to voting over the last 10 years. So these are the kinds of factors that come into play. And one challenge that we have is to make sure that the local officials in these subdivisions that end up requiring pre-clearance don't feel self-guilt over these things, because they weren't necessarily in place in office when these incidents did happen. But like the southern states found 50 years ago when the Federal Voting Rights Act was enacted, there's been a level of vote dilution, of voter suppression that this law is fixing, is making sure that everybody is treated equally and has the right to vote. So I hope I haven't given you too much in the last 10, 15 minutes, but it was a pleasure to meet with you this evening. I'd be glad to answer any questions. I've seen a bunch of questions in the queue before I began speaking, and I'm sure with the Senator and Perry, here we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I'm sure many of us will be registering for your class next semester. But with that, we will open it up for Q&A. If folks want to use the raise hand function, I'll try to get some of the questions from the chat as well. But right before we get there, just a quick plug / announcement. A couple of folks are talking about how to get more involved or how to get others involved. So Democracy NYC, which is a part of the Civic Engagement Commission, will be having multiple days of action coming up, particularly for next month's election, but they do that year round. Also, we have Samira from the Civic Engagement Commission on the call. They also have a very impactful program where they'll head to Rikers Island and register folks to vote. I actually went myself last month, and it's a truly a unique experience. Samira will put her information in the chat. So if anyone wants to participate in that or know more about that, feel free to reach out to her. So with that, let's open it up for some questions. If anyone want to raise their hand, we'll start with the raise hand first, and then we'll get some from the chat. I know there was a lot of information to digest, but I'm sure some folks have some questions.
Oh,
Mr. Beetham, get us started. You're muted. You want to unmute? Almost. There you go. Perfect.
Okay. First of all, thanks to all of the presenters. I would like to know from Professor Weiss, Tim, is it possible that we can have a copy of his printed information that we just saw? There is a lot of information in there that I would like to read so I can get a better understanding. Therefore, it will enable me to help the people in my community by having a copy of his presentation.
Most definitely, yes. I'll provide it to Tim. Tim, feel free to distribute it.
Thank you very much.
Will do. Mr. Scarborough?
Yeah, I don't know if I missed it, but is there a start date? I mean, does this in effect immediately, or does it take effect at a certain date in the near future?
Well, pre-clearance will start in 1 year, but everything else in the law is already in effect.
except for
Okay.
language assistance, right? The expanded language assistance provisions will begin in 2025. The federal law, under federal law, there's a pretty limited number of languages covered in New York City. So we've lowered the threshold to make sure that there is a broader number of languages covered. So hopefully we can start to address that language diversity here in Queens and improve turnout, especially among our naturalized citizen communities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all. Adrian, up next.
Hi, my question is for Professor Weiss, and it involves the Independent Redistricting Committee, which didn't seem to be working very well. We're still facing challenges to redistricting plans, and I'm wondering if there's something that can be done to make this commission work the way the voters thought it was going to work.
That's a great question. I think there could be. The State Court of Appeals is going to hear the congressional challenge where a group of voters are asking the court to reopen the congressional redistricting to pick up where the commission failed.
Right.
And I think once the 2020 round is behind us, once we have all the Senate, Assembly, congressional lines all put to bed legally, there will be serious conversation in Albany to amend the Constitution one more time to fix the mess that was created in 2014. Frankly, I think the 2014 amendment was drafted in a way that meant it was destined to fail, and that there are ways to fix the process. It's just a matter of what the legislature itself wants to do, whether they'll go for creating a totally independent process or at least fix all the loopholes and the bells and whistles that didn't work out in the current plan. That needs to get done probably before 2028. So there is some time to do that.
Thank you.
Kimberly, next.
Hi, my name's Kimberly Cruz. I just have two things on this voting system that we have right now in New York, because currently we see like special elections from the Assembly District, like last month, Assembly District 27 in Queens, which encompasses College Point, Whitestone, Kew Gardens. It was a very diverse region. It was a great time to advocate and talk about immigration and really think about unregulated vehicles. However, the turnout was actually less than 3%, and polls were open for 10 days, at least 10 hours. So how much of the tax dollars that we're paying were actually there, with 172,000 people actually living there, and barely the BIPOC population did not know about the special elections. The Whitestone area people did not know about the special elections. So there's a lot of, yes, initiatives that are great structurally, and that's beautiful. And I'm advocating that, yes, but when people are saying, oh, voter turnout, how are we going to engage with that? I don't know if it's just putting it on civic associations that already exist, allowing enclaves to just provide information that, again, is not that centralized. So I'm not sure if there's anyone or some organization that I can reach out to, because with right now, South America, there are a lot of issues that, again, domestically affect people and will then affect the presidential elections, any other elections that we have here, because they're all, different countries, or the Jewish and Israel conversations and Arab Palestine and all of that. Those are things that really do affect voter turnout. So I'm wondering, again, there's a lot of this list in my thing right now, but I'm very frustrated because I've actually done the work and I've gone out for a year and canvassed Queens and reached out. And it just seems like I'm getting a lot of like no's of like, we don't know who to talk to. Our organization doesn't do this. Our city agency doesn't do this. And they don't send us to the next group. So you guys are the experts. Again, a lot that I said, I would love to reach out to you guys individually. But yeah, there's a lot of frustration here. Thank you.
Tim, let me jump in and start there. So one of the problems we see with special elections is simply that off-cycle elections have extremely low turnout, right? If we look at the highest turnout elections, it is November in presidential election years. We typically see turnout in the 65 to 70% or more range. Midterm elections, right? November's of even non-presidential years drops precipitously, usually down into the 40s, maybe low 50s. And then for odd year elections, right? Even when we're on cycle in November, right? The New York City mayoral election, we are looking at turnout sometimes in the 20s. And though if you go even further off that, whether it's primary elections or special elections or outside of New York City, you have school board elections in May and village elections in March, special purpose districts in November. The further you get away from those on-cycle elections, the more turnout drops like a stone. In those off-cycle elections outside of New York City, we typically see turnout below 10% and frequently below 5%. So, seeing low turnout in special elections is obviously something that we're accustomed here. I believe, I can't remember what the law is that sets when special elections for state legislative seats will occur. But certainly when it comes to improving turnout like that, the policy solution is in some respect to think about how can we better consolidate elections so that we're not running these one-off elections, because part of it is just the spillover effects, right? Your turnout is going to be higher in your state legislative election when you're also seeing ads for the governor and the AG or the president, everybody else, right? Because when we get around elections, there's so much talk about voting that it really lowers the cost of information that goes to everybody. And I've seen some questions in the chat about, why, what keeps people from voting. It's the cost of voting, right? And one of the things that we've really tried to do in New York, and that I think the legislature has been pretty successful at recently, is really bringing the cost of voting down, right? Voting is an economically difficult to justify act, right? It is civic duty. You're not getting paid for it. You may have to wait online for anywhere from a few minutes to in some circumstances, I remember in early voting in the 2020 elections, people were standing on hour-long lines, and so that's a lot. And when you see people waiting online in Georgia to vote, right, the cost of voting there is really, really high. So when we add early voting sites, when we make absentee ballots more accessible, when we add voting hours, all of this lowers the cost of voting and makes it easier to vote. The other thing that we do is the more we flood the marketplace with information, that also lowers the cost of voting by making it easier for people to know when to vote, how to vote, which candidates are on the ballot. So it's not surprising to me that in the special election, when there's nothing else going on, you're having a hard time motivating voters because they're only hearing it from one small corner that something's going on. So, what you've pointed to is really a structural problem with special elections. And it's something that we should be getting at. But frankly, it's also something we should be getting at when it comes to New York City elections and other local elections. They shouldn't be in odd years. We should not be looking at local elections, which I said before, really, really important, with 20% turnout. That is bananas. We should be having all of our elections in even years so that everybody gets the benefit of that flood of information, and everybody has, the most polling places available, the most voting hours available. We want to lower the cost of voting so that every eligible voter has as easy as time as possible to get to the polls and cast their ballots.
Thank you, Perry and Kimberly, for that. Up next, we'll hear from Daniela.
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I just have a question in regards to this year's ballot. So there are 2 ballot proposals that are on this year's ballot for city council and judicial. Can we just explain those 2? I don't know who would be able to answer that question. Thank you.
So I confess to not knowing those either in detail. I'm trying to think if these are city council or city related or charter related. I probably am not in my best area of expertise there as a state rep, but we're happy to get that information and also have Tim disseminate when we're appropriate.
Okay,
Those
thank
are
you.
constitutional amendments. Those are what those are. I'm
For
going to
sure.
put something in the chat.
Thank you. And as the senator said, we'll definitely follow up and provide in the follow-up email that I will send to everyone who joins. I'll include information about those as well. Maria, you're up next.
Thank you, Tim. And I'm glad, Senator Myrie, that you're still in this meeting. I have testified before about election reform. So first of all, the ballot proposals, they are statewide, and I just noticed them when I got my voter guide in the mail and I was looking at my ballot. And it's something that if you don't know, and those of us that have been, sort of like reform minded and wanting to grow, participatory democracy, if we don't know, then we have a problem, right? And because even when you read the language, I'm like, I don't really understand what they want. I couldn't even rationally think whether I should be voting yes or no, honestly. And I reached out to NYC Votes, and because I think they're part of the New York City Campaign Finance Board, and their mandate is to sort of help us with this. And I asked if they could, my friend Ida Masana here in Forest Hills runs a group called Let's Talk Democracy. And so we're going to try and do a forum so that, because our members have been asking. And I think it's something important. And I can see that I think NYC Votes is hiring, which makes me feel good because that means we're trying to invest in this kind of stuff, voter education, because that's really how you do it, how we can increase voter just voting, GOTV. But the reason I raised my hand too is when Perry talked about the cost of elections, and just to address efficiency and GOTV, I do think we need further election reforms. And the one that I kind of Mostly it's for ballot access. Like if we can make sure that ballot access is more efficient. Right now, if you ask most candidates, whether they're for party or public office, they spend most of their time and money. Money is time is also money. Time or money trying to get on the ballot, where you get objections to your signatures. And it's just a crazy system that we have. You know, first we used to have our primaries and we used to have to collect signatures in the summer, in the heat of the summer. Now we've got to do it in the winter. And if we could do, I mean, everyone has a voter ID number. If we could do like electronic signature collection, do you know how, I'm sure the election lawyers wouldn't be so happy with this proposal, but you know, it's not a new thing, but it certainly is a way that we would all know if someone already collected somebody's signature. Do you know what I mean? And we don't have to, everyone just waste their time. And it's horrible when you have to defend, when you in good faith really try to collect valid signatures and it turns out someone may have gotten it the day before or even early, you know, and you didn't know. And so it's very hard to do petitioning, like just to get on the ballot. And from that, you know, not just individual candidates, but I think the system, we can save a lot of money that way. So I heard, you know, that maybe that's something that is a reform that could happen. And I really implore you, if we could push that or what we could do to help you to push that. Thank you.
Yeah, Tim, sorry if I could respond very quickly. And I know we have other hands to get to. Just to say, one, thank you for the feedback. And thank you to the person who dropped the link on the explainer on school district debt limits and sewage debt limits that they will be on the ballot. I will say, substance aside, that we in the Senate passed a bill to help simplify ballot proposal language that would put requirements on how that is promulgated, that would say that it has to be plain read and understandable at a certain reading grade level. And so your instinct is 1,000% correct. Even if we know what the ballot proposal is, I've walked in and looked at the constitutional amendments and the language has been so obtuse as to defeat the purpose of putting it to the voters. And so we are working on that simplification process. And as it relates to ballot access as a candidate, there are certainly discussions that are being had around that, and ones that, you know, we have several examples from other states about how candidates can get on the ballot and still indicate support from the community. And that's certainly a conversation that I welcome.
Thank you both.
Just 2 seconds.
Yeah, sure.
Also say, I don't really know about the ballot proposals either. I remember looking them up because my neighbor asked me about them and I was embarrassed to say that I didn't really know about them. And this is also a consequence of odd year elections, right? We have constitutional amendments on the ballots that nobody knows about and nobody understands. And if this were a high information election, an even year election, the likelihood that we would know what's on the ballot and know to go vote about it would be much higher.
You know what? Count me in as 3. I knew that there were 2, but if you told me to describe them, I would have just ended the Zoom. So up next, Adra.
Sorry. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, so I have put the information in there about the proposals on the ballot. There's an audio that you can listen to and they explain what that is all about. And you can make your decision from there whether you want to vote for it or against it. They seem pretty simple to me, but again, they don't write the language so that it's convenient for everybody. But what I wanted to say, well, first of all, thank you so much for Tim for putting this together. It's very informative, and I want to thank all the presenters because the information is so valid and so important. Things that I will take and use to further spread the information in my community. But what I wanted to say was this: we need to start doing voter education early. We can't wait until we start the vote. We have to start way before that. The same thing I say about the census. Why are we waiting? We're already 4 years out from the census. We should start right now talking about the census because the census also impact whether people are going to vote or not. So we need to start doing more informational sessions earlier in the process rather than later. And I think maybe that will help to bring people out to vote, because the more information you give them up front, the better informed they're going to be. That's all I had to say. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I couldn't agree more. If I could jump in, tell me how to pronounce your name. I don't want to mispronounce it.
Adjoa.
Adjoa? Adjoa? Okay, I'm good. All right, I just want to make sure I'm saying, as someone that has a funky sounding name, you know, I respect, you know, pronouncing people's names correctly. So I want to make sure that I got you. But Adjoa, I just want to say this is such an important point, and one that we took really seriously in 2019 when we passed pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. Right, so we now have allowed for, you know, it's mostly juniors, seniors, some sophomores in high school to pre-register. They turn 18 automatically in. But we have not done enough to encourage people to do it. And one of the things that I would like for us to consider as individuals that care about voting rights and increasing participation is, like, let's have all of our high schools have a period, just takes one period, bring all the juniors into the auditorium, bring all the seniors into the auditorium, and have them pre-register. I think that, you know, if you look at the numbers, this is about 172,000 New Yorkers eligible to pre-register. They turn 18 by the time it's 2025 or 2029. They can change the complexion of an entire race. And so I think it's important for us to be thinking about our young people, because as we know, if they vote early, they will then vote often.
Exactly.
Well
If I
said.
could also just add to that, I love to hear talk about the census before, you know, in the middle years of the decade. One of my mantras is to make the census as everyday as morning coffee and Rice Krispies. And let me suggest that sometime in the near future, you have one of these meetings focus on how community groups can work with census data, learn about the census in the off years, and build the kind of education program so that we don't start scurrying around in 2029 in preparation for 2030.
That's my point. Got it.
Thank you so much.
We'll be on it. Thank you all. I just want to be mindful of time. We'll do about 9 more minutes, and then we'll start wrapping it up. Aracelia, you're up next.
Yes, I know some people have touched on this point, but what I think that definitely needs to be done, because I know for myself, when I go to the polls, you're not even told to look on the back of the ballot. You don't even know sometimes who is on the ballot, and we're not educated as to exactly everything or the questions or how it relates to our community. And not only that, if it's not a lead race, where it's like councilwoman, mayor, or something like that, you don't even know who these judges are. We need to be educated in a way as to how we ought to vote. And that's definitely a problem. And we don't usually hear about these questions until maybe about a month before it is to vote. Oh, vote this way or that way. But why are the questions on the ballot? So we need we need to be educated.
Good point. Evie, you're up next. You have to unmute though. You're muted.
Hi, it's Evie.
Evie, sorry about that. Evie,
So
you're up.
I have a slightly different concern, which is of the 8+ million people living in New York City, roughly 2 million are justice impacted. And only 1 in 4 of my people, because I'm formerly incarcerated, are even registered to vote. And before we get to how to read the ballot, that's a huge percentage of the population that doesn't want to vote for the people that they perceive to have put them in prison. And so I've been trying to design a training program. Oh, sorry about that. I have a puppy. I have a puppy that likes to let you know she's here. Boo-boo, boo-boo. Anyway, we need another program way ahead of the elections that's that trains people, that brings back the notion of why we should vote to begin with. And I think without that, we can pass a lot of laws, but if we don't get people to the polls. And I think we have to target populations differently as to what their needs are. So our needs, my need is to run a series of training programs with formerly incarcerated business leaders to have them bring their networks in. But I think that, just to keep this short, my concern is getting people not only to register, but to care enough to even to vote. And I know with my population, that is a huge issue.
Yeah, if I may, but firstly, thank you, Evie, right?
Evie, thanks.
Thank you, Evie, for sharing that. This is really an intersection of two of the things that I care very deeply about, and that individuals that are justice involved and in our democracy. So we've taken some steps when we passed, and it was just signed into law this year, about extra notification to individuals leaving incarceration, whether that is a jail or prison, about their rights to vote and where they can go to get more information. But I think you're addressing something even deeper, and that is, why would you engage in a democracy when that democracy has not engaged with you? And that where you have had institutional relationships, it has been one of oppression and one of injustice in many instances. And I think that also speaks to not just that population, but to any New Yorker that is not engaged in their democracy. If you are struggling to put food on the table, if you are struggling to get a job, if you have no other opportunities, why would you say on election day or during early voting that I'm going to vote for a system that has not produced for me? So I think when we talk about democracy, certainly as I talk about it with my colleagues, I say you got to do your job first, so that people know that you're up for the interview. And that, when you phrase it that way, when the government has not performed for you, we can't then say, well, you have to vote, you have to vote, you have to vote, because it has not been responsive. More mechanically, I sponsor a couple of bills, and there will be some more forthcoming, where I think we should have in certain correctional facilities polling stations, places where people can go vote. You do not automatically lose this constitutional right once you are incarcerated. And I think we should, for those individuals who are eligible, even if incarcerated, they should have an opportunity to participate in their democracy if they have not lost that right. And I think that's a harder sell to some of my colleagues and people in the democracy space. But it's one that I think is really important because at a point in time in this country, people that look like you and people that look like me could not vote at all. And were banned from that, and that was accepted. And I don't think that we should subscribe to some of the mistakes of our past.
If I could just make two quick comments,
Sure.
when Trump can get arraigned in his car in 15 minutes, and I have to sit for 8 hours in a cold cell before they even talk to me, what's going on in the courts with the lawyer today who's getting probation when she threatened national security, and there are many, and there's still lifers in prison for pot. There's a much deeper issue. We need some funding for education. The polls are not the answer. Putting a physical kiosk in a prison is not the answer if you don't care. We have to make people care. They have to understand they're voting for carceral positions like judges and prosecutors. They have to understand they don't have a clue about a ballot initiative or even have motivation to read it. So we can work on changing the laws, but as long as 80 million people in this country have been convicted of some kind of crime, and you have a quarter of the population disinterested, you've got to get them engaged. Funding is needed. Funding is needed not to get them to register to vote. Funding is needed to get them to understand why they should be a stakeholder.
Gosh.
And that's the key for us. And I'm trying very hard to design some training programs that can engage them, but that's a long-term this is not a 5-minute task. If you want to, we represent a huge part of the voting block, and we need to engage them as stakeholders.
Thank you for that. Very important.
Tim, if I can just make a very quick point. I think one of the important things that Evie, that Araceli, that Kimberly, that Maria have all really raised is the importance of organizing, right? It is so hard to organize. It takes so much effort, but the payoff is so big. Getting folks tied together, informing each other, getting each other to the polls, getting each other to hold elected officials accountable, getting each other to build and win accountability, that matters so much, and it is so hard, but it makes the work all the more important. So when I look on this Zoom and I see so many people whose names are affiliated with civic organizations and all kinds of local organizations, it makes me really happy to see that happening. And I just hope more and more folks understand the value of organizing. And it doesn't need to be that you get 1,000 people together. You know, you and your family and your next door neighbors, you guys are already a powerful block on your own, and every bit of energy you pour into organizing is so powerful.
Well said. Last word goes to Michelle, and then we'll wrap it up.
Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes, you're good now. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. I just want to thank everybody for being here. This is a subject that's really near and dear to my heart. And I just feel like everybody's touched on a lot of subjects. As somebody that's a poll worker trainer, coordinator for early voting and election day, I really take this very seriously. And I do my best when I'm training poll workers to sort of give them an idea about their civic duty. A lot of people want to sign up. They want to say, I want to collect money. It's just not about collecting money. When people come through my class and I'm training them, make sure you tell the voter, if they're voting by a scannable ballot, to look on the back of it. Someone said it, and they couldn't be more correct, because, you know, you have proposals, you have other candidates. If someone's voting by an affidavit, make sure you follow through all the steps. Make sure they come back to you. You check what their affidavit, all the information. And we as poll workers, we have to make sure we check our information. Take the next step, give it to the person that's sitting next to you, your co-poll worker. That way, when they get the letter in the mail, it will say, thank you for voting, instead of saying, I'm sorry your vote didn't count because there was information that was missing. Now, having said that, this is a concerted effort from everyone. This is an effort from everyone that everybody needs to get, on board with. We all need to sort of, all our political, local officials, I'm thinking we could like host some voter education training, because it's a big thing that we need to do on a large scale. How we host all these events and all this other kind of stuff. Let's host some education training for voting. It's just not about registering these young kids and other people to vote. It's about voter education. Why do people want to register to vote? Why should they register to vote? And, you know, how their vote will count and how it will affect their local communities. Sometimes people only come out a presidential election. I always emphasize, come out with the elections to vote for your local elected officials. Those are the ones who are going to say what's happening in your neighborhoods. The money's coming here. This is, you want to improve things in your neighborhood, so you got to get out and vote. So if you explain to people on those type of terms, you know, a lot of times you could get more people to come out and vote. And while someone's in the wrong location, just don't vote by affidavit and it's not going to count. Go to your poll site where your vote is going to count, where your local elected official will be on your ballot. All of these things are key issues coming together on a wide scale for the the borough president, if you're the mayor, whoever you are as a local elected official, get together, start hosting some workshops to educate our people about voting and what their voting rights are. Not just to register to vote, but why you should register to vote. And that's my 2 cents, because this is something, upcoming election, early voting is starting on October 28th for people for 9 days. General election is going to be November 7th, okay?
Thank you
And
so
thank you
much.
so much for your time. I'm very passionate about this because this is a very important thing.
We hear it through that very eloquent soliloquy. But thank you for
Thank you
that.
so
And
much. And thank you for handing out the ballot, the voter registrations when you and the BP were hosting that time, going out into the different neighborhoods. Everybody, Timothy went over to the Board of Elections for me because I was working at a different job, and he actually literally picked up some voter registration forms to hand out. So Timothy is the guy. Everybody on here, I respect you so much for this. Is what happens when communities have the opportunity to come together. Thanks to the BP for giving us this platform. This is how we're supposed to all work together.
thank you, Michelle. They're gonna start thinking I gave you some money to say that, so we'll have to start wrapping it up now. But
everybody over here knows I'm always talking about you. So maybe if they're new, but everybody knows that.
thank you, really appreciate it. It is a team effort. It's a group collective. Thank
Yes,
you.
most
I just want to give
definitely.
the last word to our speakers, Senator Myrie, Perry, Professor Weiss, if you want to close us out with any final words.
Yeah, all I have to say is thank you so much for allowing us to be with you this evening. Thank you to all of the participants for all of the work that you're doing in the community. We appreciate you very much. I just dropped my email in the chat if you have any questions, concerns, or complaints. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much for being here, Senator. Really appreciate it.
I'll just say a very, very quick thank you. My email is in the chat. Always makes me feel good to see all these folks coming out and caring so much and hanging around a conversation about voting rights for so long. So please keep it up. Keep doing Queens proud. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Perry.
I will join my colleagues in thanking you. My email is also in the chat, and I'd especially like to follow up with a whole new chapter on the census. So please get in touch with me. Thank you.
Will do. So without further ado, folks, thank you so much for being here today. Hope you have a great rest of your evening, and we'll be back in November. Thanks so much, folks. Take care.
Good night.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Have a
Good night,
great
everyone. Thank you,
Good night.
everybody.
Good
Have a
night,
blessed
Good night,
everyone.
everyone.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Fire.